My husband spent my 30th birthday with his ex-wife, so I brought my new man to his mother's funeral. The morning had started at 7. I remember the exact time because I'd woken up early to make eggs the way Connor liked them. No salt, a little too much pepper, the yolk just barely broken so it bled across the whites. I was standing at the stove in the birthday dress I'd bought 3 weeks earlier from a boutique in the West Village. A deep green thing with a fitted waist that I'd tried on twice and talked myself out of and then gone back for on a Thursday afternoon when the shop was quiet. It was the kind of dress that required a reason. I had one. I was turning 30, and my husband and I had a reservation at Luce for 8 o'clock that evening, and I had not been taken somewhere nice and longer than I wanted to count. Connor came downstairs at 7:58. He was wearing the navy shirt I'd given him for our 4th anniversary, the one from the slim rack at Nordstrom that I'd held up against my forearm to check the color before I bought it. He smelled like the cedar soap he kept on his side of the bathroom. He looked good. He always looked good. That was one of the things that had made it so easy to forgive him, over and over, for 2.5 years longer than I should have. He picked up his keys from the counter and his phone lit up in his hand and his whole face changed in a way I had learned by then to read very precisely. "Melissa's dad," he said. He didn't look up. "Heart attack. She needs me." I set down the spatula. The eggs were still on the burner. I said, "Connor, her father had a heart attack in February. He had one the October before that. He said he'd be back in 1 hour. He left at 8 a.m. in the shirt I bought him for our anniversary." I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car reverse out of the driveway, and he did not look back once. I stood there long enough for the eggs to go cold and for the February light to shift the shadow of the oak tree 3 inches across the kitchen floor. 1 hour became 4. 4 became 8. At 6 o'clock in the evening, he sent a text that said, "She's too upset to cook. We're grabbing dinner." No question mark. No apology. A statement of fact, like a weather report. Our reservation at Luce had been for 8. By 6:15, I had already called and canceled it, and the woman on the phone had said, "I'm so sorry and happy birthday," and I had thanked her in a voice that sounded completely normal, which I now understand is a skill, not a quality. I called him at 7, he picked up on the 4th ring, and in the background, very clearly, I heard Melissa laughing. Not crying, not the broken, gasping sound of someone whose father had been rushed to the ICU. Laughing, the loose, unguarded laugh of someone watching something funny on television from a couch. I recognized it because I had heard it before, at family dinners when she'd lean across the table toward Connor with her chin in her hand and laugh at something he said before he'd even finished saying it. He came home at midnight. I was sitting in the kitchen in the dark. The overhead light was off. The birthday dress was still on. I hadn't moved the plates. The cold eggs were still on the counter, covered with a dish towel I'd laid over them at 9 because I hadn't known what else to do with my hands. I heard his key in the lock and I sat very still and I waited. Connor turned on the overhead light and looked at me and said, "Emergencies happen." He said I was being selfish. He said that Melissa had needed him and that was what good people did, they showed up. He had bought her flowers at the hospital gift shop. Yellow tulips, he said, because he knew she liked yellow, and the detail landed somewhere between my ribs and stayed there. He had bought her yellow tulips on my birthday, while I sat in a birthday dress I had bought for a reason that no longer existed. He brought me nothing. The next morning, I went looking for the truth, the way I had learned to do by then, which was quietly. Melissa's father had not been near a hospital. The emergency had been heartburn from 3 slices of pizza, a detail I learned from Connor's cousin Diane, who had texted Melissa at some point during the evening and received a voice memo back, a cheerful, entirely relaxed voice memo in which Melissa said, quote, "Dad's totally fine, Connor's here. It's actually kind of great." Diane had forwarded it to me at 10:47 at night and then immediately sent a second text that just said, "I'm so sorry." I had not responded to either message, but I had screenshotted both. What I understood by that morning, though I had understood pieces of it for much longer, was that this had never been about emergencies. The structure of it was too clean, too repeating. Christmas of 2022, Connor had left our apartment at noon on December 24th because Melissa's pipes had frozen. He'd come back on the 26th. Valentine's Day the following year, she'd called at 6:30 p.m. as we were getting into the car, crying about something she later admitted to him had been a misunderstanding with a coworker. Our 3rd anniversary, she'd sent a series of texts that Connor had described as spiraling. He'd spent 3 hours in the parking lot of a CVS on the phone with her while I sat inside a restaurant and ate bread and waited and then did not wait anymore and went home. 5 years. 5 years of my marriage interrupted at its edges by a woman who had been divorced from my husband for 2 years before I met him, who had no children with him, no shared property, no ongoing legal entanglement that required this level of contact. Just a phone and a history and a very specific knowledge of exactly what buttons to press and in which order. She was not cartoonish about it. She never screamed or threatened or made scenes in public. She simply needed him at precise intervals in ways that were difficult to disprove and impossible to ignore. She was good at it, which I now understand was deliberate, not instinctive. And then there was Rose. Connor's mother had been a woman of particular certainties, which is the most precise way I know to say it. She had been certain from the beginning that her son's first marriage had been the correct one and that its failure had been a navigational error rather than a conclusion. She'd expressed this certainty in ways that were always deniable, always performed with a fixed smile and a fresh glass of white wine in her hand. At the first family dinner I attended as Connor's girlfriend, Rose had seated Melissa, who had also been invited, which I had not known in advance, directly to Connor's left. and had placed me at the far end of the table between an uncle with a hearing aid and an empty chair. I had assumed this was an oversight. It was not. By year 2, I knew the seating arrangement was architecture, not accident. Melissa was always beside him. I was always across the room. Rose brought out the wedding album at least 4 times in the years I knew her, flipping to the pages with a soft, reminiscing sigh, passing it to relatives who would hold it and nod and say things like, "You two looked so happy," while I sat in whatever chair had been assigned to me and looked at the wall. Once, at Easter, Rose had put her hand on Connor's forearm while looking directly at me and said, "There were just some years that were," and she had paused and shaken her head, and not finished the sentence. She didn't need to. I ate the dinner and drove home and sat in the driveway for 11 minutes before I went inside. What I did not do in any of those moments was react. I had, early on, tried the direct approach, the quiet conversation, the expressed concern, the reasonable request. Connor had listened carefully and then explained to me each time that I was misreading the situation, that Rose was just sentimental, that Melissa was just struggling, that I was seeing patterns where there were none. He said it gently. He believed it completely. That was the part I had the hardest time explaining to people afterward. He was not lying to me. He simply had a very strong investment in a particular version of events, and the version he preferred did not have room in it for the thing I was describing. So I stopped describing it, and I called Lucas. Lucas and I had dated for 8 months, 6 years earlier, before I moved to New York for work. We had ended it without damage. One of those rare things, a relationship that closes cleanly because the timing was wrong and both people knew it. We had stayed loosely in touch the way people do, a reaction to a post occasionally, a birthday text. When I reached out and suggested coffee, he suggested a place in Cobble Hill that I'd mentioned once, 3 years earlier, in a message I had half forgotten. He remembered it. He remembered my coffee order: oat milk, no sugar, a little too hot. Without asking, he put his phone face down on the table and did not turn it over once in 90 minutes. I told him I was not happy. I did not tell him much more than that, not yet. I also did not tell Connor. I did not tell my sister, who liked Connor and would have worried. I did not tell Diane, who would have meant well and texted at the wrong moment. I told no one. What I did instead was open my calendar app, the same one I'd had for 3 years, and I began to mark the dates. Every cancellation, every redirected evening, every event I had attended alone because Connor had received a call and needed to step out for just a minute, and had not come back. I used red dots. I placed them carefully. By the end of the month, I had 11. By the end of the month, I had 14. By March, I had 19, and I had a folder on my phone, organized by date, that contained screenshots, forwarded voice memos, restaurant cancellation confirmations, and a 3-page document I had typed myself from memory, sourced to specific dates, specific times, specific quotes. I was not building toward drama. I was building toward clarity. In March, Rose was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was 4 to 6 months. Connor took the call in the living room, and I watched his face go through the particular geography of real grief, which looked different from the performed concern he used when Melissa called, and I felt something genuine for him in that moment. Whatever else was true, he loved his mother. I didn't contest that. What happened in the months that followed, I watched from a remove that I had by then learned to maintain. Rose's illness had a way of organizing the household around her preferences, which had always been the case but now had moral weight behind them. Melissa visited the hospital 3 and 4 times a week. She brought flowers and soup and sat at Rose's bedside for long afternoons while I worked, and Connor shuttled between the house and the oncology ward at NYU Langone. In the final weeks, when Rose's clarity came and went, I visited on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I sat beside her, I held her hand when Connor wasn't in the room. I was not performing. I am capable of grief without an audience. But there were 2 moments in those final weeks that I want to be exact about, because they matter to what came next. The first was a Tuesday, about 3 weeks before Rose died. Connor was parking the car. I was sitting beside Rose's bed, and Melissa was on the other side, and Rose reached across and took Melissa's hand and said very clearly, "You were the daughter I always wanted." She said it looking at Melissa, but she said it in a room where I was present, and she didn't look at me, and she didn't lower her voice. The second was a Thursday. Connor was in the room this time. Rose was having a clear afternoon. She looked at her son and said, "Do you ever regret it? Choosing wrong?" She did not gesture toward me. She didn't need to. Connor said, "Mom," in a warning tone, and Rose closed her eyes and the conversation ended, and we drove home in silence. Rose died on a Thursday morning in April at 7:43 a.m., with Connor beside her. I was in the hallway. The funeral was Saturday at 11. I arrived at 10:50, which is to say I arrived exactly on time in a black dress and low heels with my hair done and my face composed. I took a seat in the first row to the right, not the family row, but close. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked exactly as sad as the situation required, which was genuinely sad because a woman had died, and grief is not a performance even when it exists alongside other more complicated things. Lucas walked in at 11:02. He was wearing a charcoal suit, well-fitted, the kind that suggests someone who dresses with intention rather than effort. He walked in without hurrying, found me without looking for me, and sat down beside me and took my hand with no words, no performance, no announcement of himself. He simply arrived the way a person arrives when they know they belong somewhere. Connor was at the podium. He had been mid-sentence. Something about his mother's garden, her roses, the specific way she laughed, and he stopped, completely. The silence stretched for long enough that people in the pews shifted and looked up from their programs. Connor found the page again, found his voice again, but the voice was different for the rest of the eulogy. Thinner, measured against something. Lucas kept his hand over mine and did not look at the podium. At the reception afterward, held in the church hall with tea sandwiches and the particular refrigerated floral arrangements of institutional grief, Melissa materialized at Connor's side within minutes of his stepping off the dais. She arranged herself against him in the way she had always arranged herself. One hand on his forearm, body angled inward, positioning herself in the negative space between Connor and everything else. She was whispering something close to his ear. Once or twice she turned in a way that I recognized, not quite blocking his sightline but occupying it, so that to look toward me he'd have had to visibly maneuver around her. He maneuvered around her. Lucas stood beside me with one hand resting on the small of my back. Rose's friends moved through the room, women in their 60s and 70s in dark blazers holding teacups. And more than once I noticed them glancing over. Rose had known everyone in this room for decades. They had watched her son's first marriage from the inside. They knew the shape of things. One woman, silver-haired in a jacket with a brooch on the lapel, leaned toward the woman beside her and said, in a voice calibrated to carry, "What a handsome couple." Connor's face went the color of the church hall wall. He crossed the room in the particular fast walk of a man trying not to appear to be moving quickly, and went through the door to the kitchen. I counted to 15. I followed. The kitchen was bright and smelled like industrial cleaner and the remains of the food trays. Connor had his back to the door when I came in. He turned around when he heard me. His jaw was working. "Who is he?" he said. Not a question, an arrival. I said, "Someone who remembers my coffee order." Connor's eyes did the thing they did when he was reaching for a response that hadn't arrived yet. His voice, when it came, was lower than usual and had a quality I can only describe as unsteady at the seams. "How long?" "Since my birthday," I said. I let that sit for a moment the way you let a number sit when you want someone to do the math themselves. "The birthday you spent with Melissa while her dad recovered from his very dangerous pizza." Something passed across Connor's face, a flinch, quickly reassembled. He said, "That's not fair." I reached into my bag and took out my phone. I opened the calendar app, 19 red dots across 2 years of dates, looked back at both of us from the screen. I held it out to him. "Pick one," I said. "Pick any date and tell me it was worth it." He looked at the screen for a long time. His face went from red to pale to something I had not seen on it before and cannot name precisely except to say it was the face of a person who has been shown a document they had hoped didn't exist. Then his jaw tightened and he looked up slowly and he said, "You were building a case this whole time." "I was keeping records," I said. "There's a difference." He said, very quietly, "I want you to leave." I said, "I know." I walked back out through the reception, took Lucas's arm, and we left together. The following Monday, I met with an attorney named Patricia Ose, who had come recommended by a colleague and whose office on the 14th floor of a building on Lexington Avenue was the kind of office that makes a certain kind of person feel that the world has correct structures in it after all. I laid the folder across her desk, the screenshots, the voice memo transcripts, the calendar printout with the 19 red dots, the restaurant cancellation confirmation from my birthday, the 3-page memo I had typed from memory and cross-referenced to specific dates. Patricia read in silence. When she looked up, she said, "How long did it take you to put this together?" I said, 8 months, mostly on Tuesday evenings. She said, "This is thorough." She said it the way a person says a thing they mean precisely. Then she talked to me for an hour and 40 minutes about the shape of what was possible. The divorce filing came through on a Wednesday. Connor had moved to his cousin Ryan's apartment in Astoria by then. A fact I knew from Diane, who texted me a photograph of a moving box labeled kitchen on Ryan's front steps without any additional commentary. The filing covered the dissolution of the marriage, the equitable distribution of the joint accounts. There was a joint savings of $94,000 that Connor had been moving money into from his direct deposit in increments small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. A detail Patricia discovered in the first financial disclosure, and a civil claim for intentional infliction of emotional distress, which Patricia said was a harder threshold but said the documentation made it viable in a way most cases weren't. The response from Connor's attorney arrived 11 days later. It was what Patricia had anticipated, a counter-narrative. The calendar was characterized as an obsessive document compiled to support a premeditated exit strategy. There was language about my relationship with Lucas that implied predating the marriage without evidence. There was a claim that I had emotionally withdrawn from the marital relationship beginning in the first year, which was, Patricia noted dryly, a description of what happens when one party spends 5 years being assigned to the far end of the table. The counter-narrative had a problem, which was the voice memo. Diane, when asked formally, provided a written statement confirming the date, time, and contents of the voice memo from Melissa. Melissa's voice saying, "Dad's totally fine, Connor's here, it's actually kind of great." On the evening of my birthday, while I was sitting in the dark in a dress I had bought for a reason, the statement was notarized. Diane had also, separately, provided a written account of 3 family dinners at which she had personally witnessed the seating arrangements and the wedding album, with dates and who else had been present. Two of the people Diane named provided their own statements without being asked, once they understood what was being documented. Connor's attorney went quiet for 9 days. When he came back with a settlement offer. The joint savings, the full $94,000, was to be transferred to my account within 30 days. The marital property, a co-op in Greenpoint that we had purchased together and that had appreciated by $340,000 since the purchase date, was to be listed and the proceeds split 60-40 in my favor, a division that reflected Connor's use of joint funds to purchase gifts, yellow tulips among other things, for a third party during the marriage. Patricia had requested 3 years of joint credit card statements. She found what she found. The civil claim was settled separately, $27,500 paid in 2 tranches, the first within 60 days of signing. Connor did not appear at the settlement conference. His attorney did. The attorney looked like a man who had spent the previous 2 weeks reading documents he had not anticipated reading. His face when Patricia laid the credit card statements on the table had a particular quality to it that I have since seen described in other contexts as the expression of a person discovering in real time that their client had not told them everything. That was enough. The co-op sold in June, 6 weeks after the listing. The final proceeds came to $287,000 after fees, of which my share was $172,200. That transfer cleared on a Tuesday afternoon. I was having lunch in Cobble Hill when Patricia texted me the confirmation. The restaurant was the same one Lucas had suggested for our first coffee, the one I had mentioned once in a message 3 years earlier that he had somehow held on to. I did not cry. I ordered another glass of water and finished my salad and walked home. Connor, I heard from Diane, moved to a 1-bedroom in Flushing. He and Melissa had a brief period of whatever it was they had always been having, but Melissa, it turned out, was significantly more interested in the version of Connor that was unavailable than the version that showed up at her door. By October, she was seeing someone else. Connor was, last I heard, working the same job, driving the same car, wearing, presumably, some of the same shirts. I moved to a smaller apartment in Brooklyn Heights in July. It has 1 bedroom and a window in the kitchen that gets morning light, and I have a small table under it where I have coffee most mornings. Lucas lives 12 blocks away. We have dinner on Thursdays. I joined a ceramics class on Tuesday evenings, which means I no longer have Tuesday evenings free for keeping records, which is, on balance, an improvement. The green dress is still in my closet. I wore it once more in September to a birthday dinner for a friend. Someone I didn't know said it was a great color on me. I said thank you. I meant it. The calendar app I deleted in August. There was nothing left in it worth counting.